The late Professor Francois Bovon, one of the finest professors of New Testament that I had the privilege of studying with, and the author of an excellent commentary simply titled Luke, remarks, the first draft of these pages, the first draft of the pages dealing with the story of Mary and Martha, the first draft of these pages received a vehement and passionate reaction from my assistants, Isabel and Eva. They argued that I was being too hard on Martha. And later he notes, these wise women who were my teaching assistants made me reflect more on the story and reach better informed conclusions. Professor Bovon, kind and gentle soul that he was not the first male scholar or preacher to bring to his interpretation of this story very male assumptions and attitudes. Duly warned by my professor's experience, I will now wade into the interpretation of the story myself. I do so acknowledging that I am a man whose meals are cooked for him, whose clothes are washed and ironed for him, whose home is kept tidy and attractive for him, who is allowed to meditate on higher things in the comfort of an attractive study by a devoted wife who is, I think she would admit, occasionally distracted by many things, especially when guests are arriving. This coddled and comforted preacher will now dare comment on the words of Jesus, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of one thing only. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Luke sets up the story for us, writing that Jesus and his disciples arrive for a visit at the home of his friends, Mary and Martha. An arrival of a guest in that time and tradition, the arrival of a guest honors the home, and all other concerns are set aside. The best of food, wine, and table service is offered to one's guests. A hostess wouldn't think of sending out for pizza or serving dinner on paper plates. Only the best will do when a guest arrives. But doing one's best means that much work will need to be done in a short amount of time. Thus, Martha is worried and distracted by many things. Lutheran pastor, the Reverend Benjamin Duholm, writes in the Christian Century article titled Marthas Without Gender, my grandmother, he writes, died in 2005 on the eve of the feast of Saints Mary and Martha. The next day, I went to the weekday Eucharist at St. James Cathedral in Chicago, and the story of Martha and her sister brought me instantly to tears. Like so many women of her generation, and not only hers, my grandmother was deeply identified with her hospitality and service. She was a lot like Martha, and I loved her for it. I am more troubled now than I was then at the way this story is gendered in our reading. I have yet to meet an overworked male who felt implicated by this story. And I have yet to meet a woman who openly identifies with Mary rather than Martha. It seems very hard for us to get past the idea that women in particular are evaluated, even by Jesus of Nazareth, on their ability to rightly order domestic tasks. Jesus' words to Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. Mary has chosen the better part, have the ring in our ears, of a general rebuke to the busy contemporary woman. Martha would have been comfortable, I think, in the world of Reverend Duholm's grandmother. Martha was a good host and wanted her guests to be comfortable, but she needed and expected Mary to help. Her complaint against Mary seems reasonable, and Jesus' response insensitive. And it doesn't take a therapist to realize that the heat is rising in that kitchen, and it isn't just because of the stove. Overwhelmed by the many tasks of preparing a meal and hosting guests, and fed up with her sister who is doing nothing to help with the work, Mary loses it. And like so many of us, when she loses it, she does things she shouldn't do and says things she shouldn't say. Standing imperiously in the doorway, she impatiently complains, "Lord, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." She discharges her anger in front of her guests, and everyone, for a moment, is a bit uneasy. Then, gently chiding, Jesus replies, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Visualizing this scene and thinking about what this might be saying about our faith, we can see that an important statement of principle is being made. Note that Mary is seated at the feet of Jesus. Even today, that phrase, to sit at someone's feet, suggests the relationship of teacher and student, master and disciple. Had Jesus adhered to the traditional teachings of his faith, she wouldn't have been seated there. His religion taught that women were unfit for learning the lessons of faith. Most teachers of religion wouldn't think twice before repeating the axiom common to the time, quote, "It is better to burn the Torah than to teach it to a woman," end of quote. Such an attitude was not for Jesus. Jesus believed that God had created men and women as equals, that the gospel was good news for women as well as for men. So Jesus teaches Mary, acknowledging her as a student and a disciple. And Mary, for her part, devotes her full attention to her teacher's words. She wants to learn from him and puts her gender-specific duties aside. She wants to be a disciple. At quite another level, Jesus seems to be saying that in his hierarchy of values, listening takes precedence over doing. Martha's distraction by the many things that need doing has the impact of not allowing her to listen to Jesus, much less understand that Mary's listening is actually quite important. David Brooks, in his book, How to Know a Person, has much to say about the importance of active listening and engaged listening. Through carefully listening, he argues, the person you are in conversation with feels seen and respected. And if we are to learn of God, we will want to be in conversation with God. And to be in conversation with God, we will need to figure out this listening thing. For most of us, learning to listen attentively to another is challenging. Think about how we communicate, more often than not in brief exchanges, texts, emails, and the increasingly rare phone conversation. Such brief exchanges don't work well in fostering close relationships among humans, and they don't work well for our relationship with God. Thus, it is widely recognized we are better doers than listeners. We are an ambitious and busy people, not only in our homes and work and recreation, but in our church. We prepare got lunch. We host an open house on our old home day. We sing in the choir. We pound nails for the local chapter of Habitat for Humanity. We visit the sick and the elderly. We ride bicycles and walk long distances to raise funds for worthy causes. We do a lot for the church and community we love. The busy church is a healthy church, we might be inclined to say, but thinking about our busy lives in the light of our gospel reading suggests that giving time for listening to God's voice may be a lesser value for us. Putting aside even a few minutes for meditation, Bible study, and prayer in our daily lives and our daily lives is hard when there is so much to do. The late Roman Catholic writer and teacher Henry Nouwen famously struggled to find time for prayer. When he was young, he had nourished his spiritual life with regular prayer and meditation. But as his career took off, he found it increasingly difficult to find time for these contemplative disciplines. Nouwen was a popular professor at Yale and then Harvard. His books on the spiritual life were bestsellers, and he was in constant demand as a speaker throughout the Christian world. But he was deeply unhappy. In desperation, he decided to give it all up. He resigned his position at Harvard's Divinity School and went on an extended sabbatical at a monastery in upstate New York. And there, following the routines prescribed by St. Benedict so long ago, he began to experience a renewed life of prayer. And as his sabbatical neared its end and the routines and his time at the monastery came to a close, as he began to contemplate resuming what we might call a normal life, he wondered what would happen to his spiritual life when he went back to his work of writing, lecturing, and teaching. In conversation with his spiritual director, he described his concern, and I quote, "How can I develop a really deep spiritual life when I am back at my busy work? I have a tendency to finish small and large jobs as soon as possible. And as long as I remain surrounded by unfinished tasks, my prayer is nearly impossible, since I use the time for prayer to wonder about the many things I have yet to do. And it always seems that there is something more urgent and important than my prayer." I was on retreat myself when I was reading Nouwen's journal titled Genesee Diary. Like Nouwen, I was at a monastery seeking a deeper, richer spiritual life. I read his words feverishly, not wanting to put his book down until I found out how he had changed his ways. For his question was a question that was troubling me as well. How might I, then a busy local church pastor, adjust my life so that prayerful listening to God had a place of greater importance? Like Nouwen, if I had unanswered emails, phone calls to make, or a sermon to write, I would find the act of listening to God's voice almost impossible. As my reading of his journal came to a close, I learned to my disappointment that Nouwen couldn't change. that as long as he lived, he found it difficult to put aside his work of writing and speaking about the spiritual life long enough to enjoy the silence, meditation, and prayer that are foundational to the spiritual life. I was disappointed because I figured if Nowen couldn't find space in his life for listening to God, what chance did I have? There is a much beloved hymn in our hymnal titled, "I Come to the Garden Alone." You may be familiar with it. It describes the beauty of a close relationship with God, of walking and talking with God, strolling through the garden early in the morning. The second stanza of the hymn begins, "He speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet the birds hush their singing, and the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known." As beloved as this hymn is, I find my experience of God's voice a little less sweet and a lot more challenging. As beloved as this hymn is, I find my experience of God's voice usually calling me to change, toward leaving behind unworthy attitudes and behavior and moving toward a more Christ-like quality of loving and living. Listening to God's voice is not relaxation, but spiritual work, a point Martha failed to grasp. She thought Mary was loafing, but Mary was doing the hard work of listening for God's voice. As Professor Thomas Long writes in a sermon simply titled "Martha and Mary," quote, "Mary chose to listen to the Word Jesus, the living Word, who was present right in her house. And if she was going to love God and love neighbor, and if she was going to show hospitality to the stranger and care for the lost, then everything depended on her hearing and trusting that word." Last week's lesson on the Good Samaritan, which focused on doing the right thing for a neighbor in need, is given balance by this week's lesson, which focuses on listening to God. May we, God's faithful and beloved people of this time, love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength as we become careful listening disciples. And may we, God's beloved disciples in our time, love our neighbors as ourselves by doing good deeds that nourish and give life. May this be so. Amen.